All right, welcome back to the second channel, the Orthodox Meathead. Hopefully, a lot more Orthodox and at least a little less meathead. So, as a new experiment, I thought I would attempt a few video essays beyond the normal topics that I typically discuss. I've given these the working title of Sacred and Profane Essays for now, subject to change. I'll be reading from a script, so pardon my lack of eye contact. These essays are also offered simply as commentary based on my own experience, rather than attempting to represent any authoritative teaching within the church. As the saying goes, and now for something completely different. Upon the occasion of my first video essay, I thought it would be appropriate to at least touch upon one of my great loves in life, the Orthodox Church. I suppose the topic I wish to engage first and foremost on is the mass conversion of Westerners into Holy Orthodoxy, and some particulars therein. The subject of this critique will be what has traditionally been called Low Church Protestantism, as High Church Protestants and Catholics will often find themselves more in agreement with our position. And to fully address all of those, the video would be both an indigestible size and an enormous task. Though the current wave of conversions is likely a multifaceted phenomenon that potentially hours could be spent and likely will be spent by me poring over different aspects in depth, like transcendence, beauty, and timelessness. For the purpose of this essay, I will focus on one of the key aspects responsible, in my eyes, for seeing former low church Protestants inquiring and converting. Suffering is transformative and meaningful. That is, suffering faithfully as a means of self-actualization or growing into what you are meant to become. While Orthodox Christians like myself may be inclined to see this as a movement beyond what can be characterized by mere psychological or sociological terms, for the purpose of discussion I shall restrict myself to those terms, not having access to the divine mind of the Almighty. To set some guideposts, a few quotes from men much holier than me. Blessed Father Seraphim Rose tells us that suffering is an indication of another kingdom which we look to. If being Christian meant being happy in this life, we wouldn't need the kingdom of heaven. Saint Maximus the Confessor tells us that humility and suffering free a man from all sin, for the first cuts out the spiritual passions, and the latter the bodily. Finally, Saint Augustine tells us that God is a physician, and that suffering is a medicine for salvation, not a punishment for damnation. I would posit that it is this aspect of orthodoxy which many will find alluring, especially in an age of great psychic suffering. The understanding of the bitter medicine of suffering as something that, while ubiquitous, is not without purpose. One of Jordan Peterson's oft-quoted lines from Nietzsche also seems pertinent at this point. He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. Man does not seem properly equipped to be a creature of predominantly leisure. As such, it's quite possible that we have become victims of our own success as a species, despite the living conditions in much of the first world being above and beyond what could only be dreamt of 100 years ago. Indicators of underlying misery seem to be on the rise. Whether you wish to evaluate suicide and other deaths of despair, addiction, mental health crises, or almost any other marker for lack of the generic concept of happiness or fulfillment, it seems few things are indexing on trend to say that more leisure time and freedom from want of the most basic things necessarily leads to happiness. A few economic misery indices have been proposed. Following just the economic data, there is a general downward trend in the economic misery since Truman, with few notable exceptions around major events such as COVID. I now propose coupling this with Maslow's hierarchy as an effective paradigm for examination in parallel. The economic indices can potentially be viewed as fulfilling the lowest two tiers of needs, physiological needs and safety. Love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization, while undeniably tangentially related to economic prosperity and the opportunity afforded to meet these needs, cannot be fulfilled entirely on economics. It is here that I believe we can begin to tease out some of the reasons that we see so many converting specifically from low church Protestantism. I would propose that a relationship exists between ranking on the hierarchy and a locus of suffering. Lower level needs, when not met, result in a suffering that is primarily bodily. Our bellies groan with hunger. We get sick, cold, wet, sunburned. However, when love, esteem, or self-actualization needs go unmet, we ache and hurt in a different way. This is existential and psychic suffering. This is a suffering for which there is not an easy solution. We can't just catch a couple of fish and make heartache and emptiness go away, nor can we build a fire to warm ourselves and repel the feelings of loneliness and lack of purpose. It is this suffering to which modern generations have been uniquely exposed to, with the lower level needs being met arguably at greater levels. It is this suffering for which no solution can be found within a bureaucratic state or government program. But what is it about those final three needs that finds ancient faith uniquely poised to answer and balm the wounded and aching soul? Love and belonging and esteem can be said in many respects to belong to all churches, which would broadly be called Christian, and even some of the sects that the most generous ecumenists would have a hard time lumping in, such as Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses. I would contend that a deeper examination into penal substitutionary atonement will reveal that this is not necessarily so, but this is yet another topic for a future essay and consideration of time. It is in the dimension of self-actualization that I wish to focus the balance of the current time. Does low church Protestantism offer a way for one to become one's potential? In a word, no for many of the traditions, though it is not entirely fair to speak of Protestantism as a monolith. Many of the Protestant traditions will hold to some form of the idea that once someone has truly been saved, they are immune to falling away. The only detail left is sanctification, which is frankly kind of an extra credit. What is the difference between the person who is saved as a young child and leads a faithful life and the one who leads a faithless life up until a deathbed conversion? Nothing that can be offered beyond speculation. More crowns to throw at Jesus' feet, a bigger mansion in heaven, greater honor in the kingdom to come. Is there any real eternal profit in sanctification or hard work? Is there any benefit to enduring or embracing hardship and suffering? Not only is there not real benefit beyond academic arguments, but suffering is often seen as a sign of personal sin and lack of true faith. This holds true both for those who affirm the eternal security of believers as well as those who don't and believe that believers can fall away. The horror stories are too many, but if someone has been in these circles for any length of time, they've likely heard of a divorce, sickness, or a tragic death that someone else knows is because of sin or lack of faith. Not only is this not a place of self-actualization and growth, it is often a place for the slings and arrows of misfortune to undermine any progress in the field and expose the victim of tragic circumstances to a second victimization. In other words, you've become a sitting duck waiting to be struck down once you've entered into the waters of baptism. Rather than the baptismal font representing an apex of self-actualization that may soon ring hollow and that there is so much left to do without any real obligation to do it, in orthodoxy the font represents the initiation into struggle rather than the end of it. There is not only room for meaningful work and self-actualization in areas of life beyond accumulating wealth and economic peace of mind, but there is the idea that the new identity that is put on in baptism as Christian is not a fully realized identity, but a seed of possibility of what we may become through prayer, fasting, sacrament, suffering, and struggle with the help of God. Rather than fleeing from struggle, the Orthodox ethos embraces it as part of our salvation being worked out. The inevitable suffering we will all experience has a place, and especially for a generation struggling with enormous levels of psychic suffering and existential dread, that place becomes a sufficient why. As one of my Oriental Orthodox friends has often reassured me, the struggle is the victory. It is with this ethos of not only embracing the struggle to come as affirming in what we may become, but of undergoing voluntary struggle through fasting, prayer, and other ascetic practices that the Orthodox Christian is strengthened to persevere and hold fast his confession. Many have discussed what has been called the bright sadness of Great Lent. It is a yearly reminder to suffer and struggle with hope. Much as the athlete learns to suffer first and foremost in his training, we are taught to embrace this bitter joy so that we may put to death our passions and die to this world a little more. And just as the athlete's suffering leads to game day performance, when the inevitable suffering of life comes our way, we can almost embrace it as we would embrace an old acquaintance. He is no stranger to us, and his presence is not unknown to us. We recognize that suffering and know to hope for the world to come, in which every tear will be wiped away and every wound tended to by an all-loving God. Instead of seeking to sanitize our lives from suffering and death, the Orthodox faith meets the pervasive existential dread of the modern age with the allure of purposeful suffering and death, so that we may become, in these inevitable events, victors rather than victims. Rather than being seen as faithless, we are reminded of the faithfulness of our saints in these situations and seek to imitate them as they imitate Christ. There's just something about that seems to ring true within the human psyche. So, let me know in the comments what you thought. If you think this is an unfair characterization of low church Protestantism, let me hear it. I'm happy to hear and potentially even give rebuttals or thoughts. But I just thought I'd do something a little different. I realize that it's not completely different because it is commentary related to orthodoxy, but some of these essays that I've been kind of toying with back and forth will be branching out into different areas. So I appreciate you guys that stuck around for all 12 minutes of this, and we'll see you guys on the next one.